The question of whether Islam should be banned in the UK is both complex and sensitive. It touches upon issues of freedom of religion, national security, cultural identity, and social cohesion. Below, we will explore arguments why Islam should be banned in the UK. For the security, cohesion, and preservation of our fundamental British values, the answer, however profoundly challenging it may be, must be yes. This is not a stance taken lightly, nor is it born of malice or prejudice. It is a conclusion reached through sober analysis of undeniable threats, persistent societal challenges, and a stark realization that our current approaches are simply not working. Now, I understand the immediate visceral reaction this proposition evokes. You think of freedom of religion, of individual liberties, and rightly so, but we must ask ourselves, what happens when an ideology, cloaked in religious garb, actively undermines those very freedoms and poses a clear and present danger to the state and its citizens? What happens when tolerance is exploited and openness is used as a vulnerability? Let me lay out our case meticulously, point by crucial point. First, let us confront the gravest issue facing our nation: national security and the persistent threat of terrorism and extremism. For too long, we have tiptoed around the uncomfortable truth that a specific pervasive ideology, often identified as radical Islamism or jihadism, is inherently linked to violence and poses an existential threat to the safety of every person on these islands. We have seen it time and again, from London to Manchester, from the streets of Paris to the markets of Brussels. These acts are not random. They are ideologically driven, and crucially, their proponents claim direct justification from specific interpretations of Islamic texts and traditions. My opponents will argue that these are a tiny minority, not real Islam. But ladies and gentlemen, regardless of how you define real Islam, the reality is that violent extremists are operating under the banner of Islam, citing Islamic scripture, and radicalizing individuals within Muslim communities. Our current counter-terrorism strategies, while vital, are a game of whack-a-mole. We monitor, we arrest, we de-radicalize, but the wellspring of this ideology continues to flow. We are fighting symptoms, not the disease. A ban, radical though it may seem, would be a decisive, preemptive measure to dismantle this ideological infrastructure. It is an attempt to sever the connection between a perceived religious ideology that incites violence and the horrific acts that result from it. If an ideology is deemed to incite violence and undermine the state, it must be treated no differently than any other seditious or harmful doctrine, regardless of its religious cloak. Our primary duty as a government is to protect its citizens, and when a clear threat persists, we must consider all measures. Secondly, we must address the deeply troubling issue of integration and social cohesion. We are a nation built on shared values, a common legal framework, and a commitment to unity. Yet, a growing concern, one that cannot be swept under the rug, is the perceived formation of parallel societies within our own borders. When certain interpretations of Islam advocate for separate legal or social systems, when fundamentalist interpretations of Sharia law are seen as superior to British law, we have a problem. This isn't about cultural differences, it's about a challenge to the very foundation of our civic identity. We see, with increasing regularity, enclaves where British laws and values are not fully respected, where different cultural norms and legal principles are applied. This leads to a breakdown in national unity, fosters cultural division, and fundamentally undermines the concept of a shared national identity. When we witness gender segregation, demands for specific dress codes to be enforced by religious zealots, or the rejection of secular education in favor of religious instruction that preaches intolerance, we are witnessing a direct affront to integration. If a religion's adherents are perceived to be unwilling or unable to fully assimilate into the national fabric, then that religion itself, in its current manifestations, becomes a barrier to the very cohesion we cherish. A ban, in this contentious view, would be a necessary, albeit drastic, attempt to compel integration, remove these cultural incompatibilities, and reassert a singular national identity and legal framework across the entire populace. The goal is to ensure that all citizens adhere to a common set of values and laws, without religious exemptions or competing legal systems. Thirdly, we must confront the uncomfortable truth about human rights violations perpetrated under the guise of certain Islamic interpretations. We pride ourselves on being a beacon of human rights, particularly for women and minorities. Yet, within our own borders, we face the insidious reality of female genital mutilation, the abhorrent practice of so-called honor killings, forced marriages, and the systemic suppression of women's and LGBTQ+ rights, practices which, let us be clear, are claimed by their perpetrators to be sanctioned or encouraged by specific Islamic doctrines. While these acts are illegal under UK law, the underlying religious justification, if allowed to persist, continues to foster environments where such abuses can occur with impunity in certain community. We are not just talking about individual criminal acts, we are talking about an ideological framework that, in the view of some, provides the justification for these atrocities. If an ideology is seen to inherently undermine the fundamental human rights as understood and enshrined in the UK, then the state has a moral obligation to intervene directly at the ideological level, rather than simply reacting to individual criminal acts after the fact. To allow the free practice and propagation of a religion that, in its current forms, enables or justifies these violations is a dereliction of the state's most sacred duty to protect all its citizens equally under the law. We cannot be a nation that stands by while medieval practices persist under a cloak of religious sanctity. Fourth, let's turn to the vital principle of freedom of speech. In the United Kingdom, the ability to express oneself freely, to critique, to question, to even satirize, is a cornerstone of our democracy. Yet for too long, we have seen this fundamental freedom curtailed by the chilling specter of accusations of blasphemy or incitement, often emanating from certain interpretations of Islam. The fear of religious backlash, of protests, of threats, or even violence in response to perceived insults to Islam leads to pervasive self-censorship. This isn't about being offensive, it's about the very right to engage in open discourse without fear of reprisal. When an ideology claims to be beyond critique, when it seems to demand that its tenets are immune from scrutiny, it fundamentally undermines the democratic right to free expression. A ban in this profoundly challenging argument would be presented as a radical, yet necessary measure to liberate public discourse, ensuring that all ideas, including religious ones, can be openly debated, challenged, and yes, even ridiculed, without any fear of religiously motivated threats or violence. We must safeguard our hard-won freedom of speech against any dogma that seeks to impose its will through intimidation. Fifth, we are compelled to defend the very soul of our nation, the preservation of core British values and the integrity of the UK's legal system. Our identity is forged in principles of parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, which is supreme over all, individual liberty, and a spirit of mutual respect and tolerance. Yet, there is a legitimate concern that certain Islamic practices, particularly the aspiration by some for the implementation of Sharia law, directly challenge and undermine these foundational principles. While I acknowledge that Sharia town councils in the UK generally operate within civil law, the fundamental premise of Sharia itself, in its entirety, is often seen by proponents of a ban as conflicting with our national legal system, particularly regarding issues of gender equality, freedom of conscience, and judicial process. When a religious system seeks to establish itself as a parallel legal or social authority, it creates a dual system of justice or a conflicting set of values that can only fragment national cohesion and undermine the supremacy of British law. A ban, however extreme, would be framed as an ultimate defensive measure to safeguard these foundational British values and to assert, unequivocally, the singular authority of the UK legal system over all its citizens, ensuring that all residents adhere to a uniform set of laws and societal norms. Finally, let's be candid about the failure of existing measures. For decades, governments have pursued strategies of multiculturalism, community engagement, interfaith dialogue, and targeted counter-extremism programs. Yet, what is the undeniable result? Persistent threats, ongoing radicalization within certain communities, and a recurring cycle of violence. The argument here is that these measures, while well-intentioned, have simply not worked. They are too slow, too reactive, or fundamentally incapable of addressing the systemic ideological problem that, we contend, emanates from certain interpretations of Islam. From this viewpoint, a ban, despite its draconian nature, is presented as a decisive and necessary step to reclaim public safety and national sovereignty. It is seen as a form of preemptive action to disrupt the ideological pipelines of extremism and to send an unequivocal message about the limits of religious freedom when it is perceived to conflict with national security and public safety. This argument frames the current situation as a desperate need for a more radical solution, born of the conviction that all other measures have demonstrably fallen short. Ladies and gentlemen, the decision before us is not about comfort. It is about courage. It is about confronting uncomfortable truths that polite society often avoids. We believe that for the future of our nation, for the safety of our citizens, and for the preservation of our cherished British values, a ban on Islam in the UK as a comprehensive ideological stance becomes a necessary and justifiable, albeit profound, intervention.